Hello, welcome back to this lecture. Now we're getting there, we're moving towards the end now. So in this chapter we're going to look at aspects of criminal law that might affect you in your working life, things that you might come across as a professional accountant. And the first one is something we're going to call whistleblowing. Now let's just tell you a little story. Imagine I work for a big factory. I'm quite low down, I just work in a very low sort of supervisor role on the factory floor. And it's come to my notice that my factory is pumping polluting chemicals out into a local river. Now I want to do something about that, but I'm scared. I can't do anything about that because I'm worried that I might get sacked. And if I get sacked, I might find it difficult to find another job. What am I going to do? Well, the whistleblowing legislation is there to protect employees like me so that I can feel safe and comfortable in making that disclosure and reporting my company's wrongdoing. Now, this isn't strictly criminal law because the whistleblowing legislation is about giving me employee rights. And what the legislation says is that if I make a disclosure about my company's polluting behaviour, my company cannot sack me in return. Now, in practice, what that means is if my company tries to sack me, then I will have a claim for unfair dismissal. So basically, I'll get compensation is the most likely remedy. Now, we're going to look at unfair dismissal in the next chapter. So we're looking at whistleblowing and this protection that it gives to the employees. Now, be careful with it. Whistleblowing does not create an obligation to disclose. It's just protection if you decide that you are going to make a report, if you're going to shop your employer. And there's been some fairly high profile cases recently. There was a case of a Network Rail employee who shopped unsafe practices by his employer. There was also numerous cases of National Health Service employees who made disclosures in respect of the safety of hospitals. So in order to fall within the legislation, you need to have some very specific acts by the employer and you need to follow the procedure in the legislation. So first of all, what's covered? Well, if my employer does anything to my detriment as a result of my disclosure, then I will have the protection of the Act. So we're looking at sacking, obviously, we've already mentioned that, being dismissed, or unfairly selected for redundancy. So, it would generally be okay to get rid of an employee. There are grounds for redundancy, but they've chosen me over all my colleagues because I made a protected disclosure. It may be unjustified disciplinary action, written warnings, things like that, to make me uncomfortable at work. They may be excluding me from opportunities, promotions, training opportunities, in order to punish me. Or perhaps they don't renew my fixed-term contract when they would otherwise have done so. So this is the sort of behaviour that the Act is seeking to prevent. How do I fall within the terms of the Act? Well, I need to be a worker. Now, that's not necessarily an employee, it's a worker. Agency workers and home workers are included as well, but not, again, the examiner might test you on this, self-employed people or volunteers. There's no minimum employment period, so don't get mixed up with unfair dismissal and wrongful dismissal, and redundancy, which we'll see in the next chapter. Now, these 3 steps are important. In order to get the protection, I must make a qualifying disclosure. So we need to check what that might be. And it must be made in the public interest. Now that's a new provision there, so we'll need to have a look what that might mean as well. And I can't just go disclosing these things willy-nilly to anybody I meet. I must make my disclosure to the right person. Okay, 3 steps, 3 things that must be proved. So let's have a look at those 3, starting with a qualifying disclosure. So a couple of key points to note here. It must be something that I reasonably believe to be true. Okay, now what is a reasonable belief is quite difficult. It's a subjective thing, it's what I believe, not necessarily what the reasonable person would believe. But the courts have said that rumour or unfounded suspicion isn't enough. Now, in your exam, the examiner seems to have taken the view that it's a good idea to have documentation to support your belief, particularly if you're trying to report something that is going to happen in the future, because it's even harder to prove something that is going to happen than it is to prove something that's already happened. So probably documentation would be a good idea, although the case law is still a little bit woolly on that. It's one of those things that will be decided on a case-by-case basis. Now, reasonable belief of what? Well, that a criminal offence has been committed or is about to be committed, so maybe fraud, maybe money laundering, maybe, in my earlier example, some sort of breach of environmental law. That a person is failed or is likely to fail to comply with a legal obligation, again, maybe health and safety. That a miscarriage of justice has occurred. Health and safety is specifically covered here. So if your workplace is unsafe and you make a disclosure about that, then that should be covered. Damage to the environment, again, is specifically included here. And possibly that something has happened within these categories and you think evidence might be concealed. So, reasonable belief in any of the above should justify a protected disclosure. Now, we said there was a new requirement. The disclosure must be made in the public interest. Now, there used to be a requirement that said disclosure must be made in good faith. So if you made a disclosure, perhaps because you didn't get a bonus or you didn't get a promotion, that wouldn't give you the protection. The new one says, well, actually, it's not really about the good faith, but it's about, is it for the good of the nation? Is it in the public's interest that this disclosure was made? Note this point here, though, again, which is new. If you do make your disclosure, and it is in public interest, you will get the protection of the legislation. But if you've done it for the wrong reason, perhaps again because you didn't get a bonus, then your damages, your compensation could be reduced by up to 25%. Okay, so the third point we had to look at was we have to disclose to the appropriate person. Now, what the Act is trying to do is to persuade people not to go running off to the police at the slightest opportunity, to follow the proper internal channels in the first instance. Now, that isn't always possible, particularly if you think it's maybe your boss or your line manager who is the person committing the offence, and the Act recognises that. So we have a list over the page of the people that you might make the disclosure to. So first of all, you should look internally to your employer or your manager. If that doesn't work, you might look at a legal advisor. A minister, now we're talking about a government minister there, not a religious minister. Or possibly a prescribed person or a regulator. We're talking here about, the FCS, the Financial Services Authority, in its latest incarnations. We might be talking about the Health and Safety Executive. We might be talking about HM Revenue and Customs. The sort of thing, you know who these people are. Ofwat, the water regulators, the energy regulators, any of those would be good. And then you may consider making a wider disclosure. If none of the above are suitable or none of the above have proved effective, you might look at disclosing to the media, the police, MPs, and in all those cases, your disclosure must not be for personal gain. So selling the story to the media is not going to get you the protection of the Act. Okay? And in addition to that, you have to show that you were justified in making your disclosure outside of the above categories. You reasonably believe that maybe you'd be victimised if you raised the matter internally. You thought that if you raised it internally, there'd be a cover-up. There wasn't anybody else you could speak to. And also, it was reasonable in all the circumstances to make that wider disclosure. Now, that's incredibly hard to prove, so you don't go running off making random disclosures unless you're pretty sure that you are protected by the Act. Now, to be honest, the examiner tends to keep questions fairly straightforward on this, understanding that there are the 3 tests and having an awareness of that sort of hierarchy of disclosures, starting internally and then going gradually wider, should be enough to get you through the questions. Now, a mention here of gagging clauses. A gagging clause is a clause in an employment contract or an agreement that says, well, It says you won't make a disclosure, basically. So, for instance, you might have a payoff package that says we'll pay you 10 grand to go away, but you must never ever disclose the things you know. Now, because of a series of quite high-profile cases, and the NHS cases were quite important there, it's been decided that any clause, any gagging clause in an employment contract or a severance agreement will be void. Okay? So basically, you just need to remember gagging clauses do not override the protection against disclosure, the Whistleblowing Act. Now, there's a little worked example there that is worth having a quick look at. And I'd suggest you just pause the recording for a second and just read through that, and we'll have a quick word about it in a moment. So in an example like this one, we're looking for those 3 tests to be satisfied. Is there a disclosure of a qualifying disclosure? Has it been made in the public interest, and was it made to the appropriate person? Well, Jasmine has discovered that her company is illegally dumping waste into a local river. So that sounds to me like a qualifying disclosure. It's damage to the environment. It's probably also breach of some legislation, so a criminal act maybe. She's raised this issue with the managing director, so that's her internal disclosure. He's ignored her. She's threatened to tell the external auditors, which again would be arguably a regulator, be the right person to disclose to. So as a result, she's been fired. So she's suffered detriment there. She's been sacked as a result of her qualifying disclosure. Now, her belief, is it a reasonable belief? Well, she's got documents, so it's substantiated. And as I said earlier, the examiner tends to make these examples quite clear-cut for you, so documents would count as reasonable belief. And the final one, was it in the public interest? Well, yes, definitely. I'm sure the public would be very interested to know that there is waste being dumped into a local river, that pollution is going on. So that's the way you need to approach these questions. Qualifying disclosure, public interest, to the right person. And has she suffered detriment as a result? Now, what will happen there? Jasmine will bring a claim for unfair dismissal. There's a range of remedies available to her, as we'll see in the next chapter, but she's most likely to be seeking damages. Okay, so that is whistleblowing, and in the next lecture we'll look at fraudulent trading.